The Hells Angels biker met the little girl shivering inside a fallen grain barn and helping her pulled him out of his ruins. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The storm had been brewing for hours, and the winds were howling through the trees like the roar of a freight train. The roads were slick, the sky heavy with dark clouds, and the temperature was plummeting by the minute. Jake Morrison, a Hells Angels biker with a reputation for being as cold as the weather around him, had been riding through the storm for what seemed like forever. The wind was biting, and his leather jacket did little to shield him from the cold. His mind was lost in the rumbling of his Harley-Davidson, trying to push away the nagging thoughts of his past. For years, he had built walls around his heart, hardened by the battles he fought both on and off the road. But something about tonight felt different. As he rounded a corner, he saw a dim light in the distance. His instincts screamed at him to keep moving. No one in their right mind would be out in this kind of weather. But then he saw it. A small barn, collapsed under the weight of the storm, its structure barely holding together. Through the cracks, he noticed movement. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, but as he slowed down, he saw her. A small, frail figure huddled in the shadows of the fallen barn. It was a little girl, no older than 6 or 7, her body shaking uncontrollably from the cold. She was alone, her face pale and streaked with tears, her small hands wrapped tightly around her body in a futile attempt to stay warm. Jake's heart sank. He didn't know why he stopped. It went against everything he had learned in his years as a biker. Danger was always lurking, and stopping could be a death sentence. But something in her eyes, the desperation, the vulnerability, pulled him in. He dismounted quickly, the cold biting through his boots as he made his way to the girl. Her eyes widened in fear as he approached, but she didn't move. "Hey, little one," Jake said, his voice rough from the cold. "You all right?" She trembled, her teeth chattering as she tried to speak, but the words didn't come out. "It's okay," he said softly, kneeling down to her level. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." The girl looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a glimmer of hope. Jake carefully lifted her from the wreckage of the barn, his hands gentle despite the roughness of his exterior. He wrapped his jacket around her tiny shoulders, holding her close to him as he made his way back to his bike. The storm was intensifying, and the cold was unbearable. The ride back to his garage seemed like it took forever, the wind howling in his ears, the girl shivering against him. But Jake didn't mind. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of his past. He just felt the need to protect this small, helpless child who had been left out in the cold. When they finally arrived at his garage, he helped her inside, his hands shaking as he tried to get her warm. He made her a cup of hot cocoa, sitting beside her as she sipped it slowly, still clutching his jacket. The silence between them was thick, but there was an understanding there, a bond formed out of shared vulnerability. Jake had been through a lot in his life, but in that moment, with the little girl safely sitting beside him, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. As he looked at her, he realized that maybe, just maybe, helping her had given him a chance at redemption. Maybe he wasn't as lost as he thought. I can hear the wind picking up outside the garage, its howl creeping through the cracks of the old building. Jake sat there, staring into the flickering light of the lamp. The little girl, now wrapped in blankets and sipping her cocoa, was quiet, but her eyes were filled with something he hadn't seen in a long time: trust. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to care. For so long he'd been numb, going through the motions of life, letting the road take him wherever it would. But something about this girl, about helping her, felt different. She had pulled him from the darkness, from the ruins of his own life, without even knowing it. He couldn't explain it, but he knew this moment had changed him. He rubbed his hands together, trying to shake off the chill that had settled into his bones. His mind drifted back to the years he'd spent riding with the Hells Angels, to the countless battles, both physical and emotional, he'd faced. He'd built walls so high, so thick, that he thought nothing could ever break through. But tonight, as he watched the little girl stare into the mug in her hands, he realized something. He hadn't just been surviving. He'd been hiding from everything, including himself. He stood up, walking over to the workbench, his boots tapping softly on the cold concrete. His hands, scarred and calloused, moved over the tools that had once been his only comfort. It was here, in this garage, that he'd tried to bury his past. But now, with the girl sitting in his corner, the past seemed to rise up again, knocking at the door of his conscience. He didn't know how to fix himself, but he knew he could fix the broken bike sitting in the corner. It was just like him, discarded, forgotten, rusted from neglect. He couldn't let that happen to her. He couldn't let her become like him. He grabbed a wrench and began to work on the motorcycle, the rhythmic sound of the tools against metal filling the silence. The girl watched him quietly, her eyes still wide with curiosity, though the fear had faded. "You like motorcycles?" Jake asked, glancing at her as he tightened a bolt. She nodded slowly, her voice soft as she spoke. "I like them. My mom used to tell me stories about bikes and how they make people feel free." Jake paused, the wrench frozen in his hand. It was strange to hear a kid talk about freedom, especially after everything he'd been through. He didn't know what it meant anymore, not in the way she saw it. To her, it was something pure, something hopeful. "She sounds like a smart lady," Jake said, his voice low. The girl smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "She's gone. Now," she whispered, barely audible. Jake's hands stilled for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had no idea what to say. He was a biker, a man who had faced danger and death without blinking. Yet when it came to comforting a little girl, he found himself at a loss. But before he could say anything, she spoke again. "I don't have anyone left," she said softly. "But you saved me." The words hit him harder than he expected, a rush of emotions flooding through him. He wanted to say something, to tell her that she had saved him too, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he just nodded, his throat tight. The garage felt smaller now, the air heavier with the weight of their shared silence. He looked at the motorcycle in front of him and realized something. He had been running for so long, running from the man he had become, from the decisions he had made. But maybe, just maybe, this girl could help him find his way back. Maybe, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. "You want to help me with this?" Jake asked, gesturing to the bike. She looked up, her eyes brightening for a moment. "I don't know anything about fixing bikes," she admitted, but her voice was steady. "But I can learn." Jake smiled for the first time that night. "We can learn together." As they worked side by side, the storm outside began to die down, the winds weakening and the snow turning to rain. Inside, the silence between them felt less heavy. He had no idea where this was going or what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe he wasn't as lost as he thought. Maybe there was hope yet. But as the night wore on, a nagging thought remained at the back of his mind. The storm might have passed, but the real challenges were just beginning. The morning light filtered through the small cracks in the garage window, casting long shadows on the workbench where Jake and the little girl, whose name was now Emma, sat side by side. The silence between them was comfortable, filled only by the soft sound of tools clinking as Jake worked on the motorcycle, occasionally explaining what he was doing. Emma, despite her small hands, was surprisingly adept at following his instructions. She passed him the right tools when asked, her face serious, her focus intense. It was as if she was trying to learn everything she could, as if the world outside the garage no longer mattered to her. The more they worked together, the more Jake felt something inside him shift. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a man defined by his past. The Hells Angels, the fights, the broken relationships, it all seemed distant, like another life. It was just him and Emma now, in this little corner of the world. She had pulled him out of his ruins, just as he had helped her. As they worked, Emma's voice broke the silence. "What happened to you?" she asked, her tone gentle but curious. Jake paused, the wrench in his hand frozen. He had hoped the question wouldn't come. He wasn't ready to face his past, not yet. But looking at her, sitting there beside him, he knew he couldn't lie. He had spent his entire life running from the truth, but maybe it was time to stop. "I wasn't always like this," he began, his voice rough, as if the words hadn't been spoken in years. "I was part of something. Something that changed me, made me think I was invincible. But I was wrong." He looked at Emma, her wide eyes watching him intently. "I did things, terrible things. Hurt people who didn't deserve it. And the worst part is, I thought I was doing it for the right reasons." Emma didn't say anything. She just looked at him, her eyes full of something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't pity, that much was clear. It was more like understanding. "I left all that behind when I found this place," Jake continued, the words coming easier now. "The club, the fights, the chaos, it all stopped being worth it. I came here to escape, to find some kind of peace. But I still carry the weight of everything I've done." He fell silent for a moment, the weight of his confession settling heavily in the air. Emma shifted beside him, her small hand reaching out to touch his arm. "I don't think you're a bad person," she said quietly. Jake looked at her, surprised by her words. "You don't know me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've done things that can't be forgiven." Emma shook her head. "But you're helping me. You're here. You're not like those other people." Jake didn't know how to respond to that. No one had ever said something like that to him before. For so long, he had been defined by the mistakes he'd made, the darkness he'd lived in. But here, with Emma, he felt something different. Maybe he wasn't beyond saving after all. "I'm glad you're here," Emma added, her voice small but strong. "You're the only person who didn't leave me." The words hit Jake harder than he expected. He had spent so many years pushing people away, never allowing anyone to get close, always fearing they would leave him like everyone else had. But Emma hadn't left. She had trusted him, just like he had trusted her in his own way. He didn't know how to explain it, but something in him softened. He wasn't just a biker anymore. He wasn't just a man defined by his past. He was someone who could make a difference, someone who could protect, someone who could help. "I'm not going anywhere, Emma," Jake said, his voice steady. "You're safe here." As the hours passed, they continued working on the bike, the connection between them growing stronger with every turn of the wrench, every shared smile. The storm outside had died down, and the world seemed quieter, calmer. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. But as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garage, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He had made peace with his past, but the future was still uncertain. As he stood back and looked at the bike, now nearly finished, he realized that this wasn't just about fixing a motorcycle. It was about fixing himself. And just maybe, it was about fixing the world around him, one step at a time. The days that followed were quiet, yet filled with a sense of purpose Jake hadn't felt in years. The garage, once a place of solitude and escape, now felt like a home. The work on the motorcycle was nearly done, but it was the small moments, the quiet conversations with Emma, that made everything feel right. He had always been a loner, but now he found himself looking forward to her questions, her curiosity. She was so different from the tough, hardened people he was used to. She wasn't afraid of him. She didn't see the leather jacket, the scars, or the history of violence. She just saw him, a person who had made a choice to help her. And that meant something to Jake. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, casting an orange glow across the garage, Jake wiped his hands on a rag, stepping back to look at the motorcycle. It was a masterpiece. Well, almost. He had done his best to repair it, to bring it back to life. He had spent days making sure every piece was in place, every part working just right. It wasn't just about fixing a bike. It was about fixing something inside him, something that had been broken for a long time. Emma came up beside him, holding a small cup of tea she had made for him. "You're doing a good job," she said, her voice soft and sincere. Jake smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not about the bike," he said, his voice low. "It's about doing something right for once." Emma sipped her tea, her eyes thoughtful. "You're doing a lot more than that," she said quietly. "You're helping me. You're here. You're not like the other people who just leave." Her words struck Jake like a punch to the gut. He had always been the one who left, the one who never stayed. But here he was, with her, and he couldn't deny it. He was staying. He had made the choice. And it felt good. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was where he belonged. But as the days passed, a feeling of unease began to settle over him. The storm that had brought him and Emma together had long passed, and the weather had turned calm again. Yet, there was something still nagging at him, something he couldn't shake. One afternoon, as he worked on the bike, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway caught his attention. He turned around just in time to see a black SUV pull up. His heart skipped a beat as the door opened, and two men stepped out. They were dressed in suits, their faces serious, their movements precise. Jake knew immediately. They weren't here for a friendly visit. They were here for something else. He stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans, his heart racing. He didn't know who they were, but he could tell they meant trouble. As they approached, one of the men spoke. "We're looking for a girl. Her name's Emma." Jake's stomach dropped. He didn't know what this was about, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let anyone take her. Not after everything they had been through together. "You're not taking her," Jake said, his voice steady, but the tension in his body obvious. The two men stopped in their tracks, sizing him up. They didn't seem scared, but they didn't seem to be in a rush either. "We're not here to cause trouble," the man on the left said, his voice calm but firm. "We just need to ask her a few questions. She's in danger." Jake's mind raced. He didn't know what they were talking about, but something in their words made him uneasy. He wasn't about to let anyone take Emma away from him. "She's not going anywhere," Jake said, stepping in front of the door to the garage, blocking their way. "I don't know who you are, but if you're here to take her, you'll have to go through me first." The two men exchanged a look, but neither of them moved. They were sizing him up, trying to figure out what to do next. "We're not here to fight you," the man on the right said, his voice calm. "We just need to speak with her. It's important." Jake shook his head. "Not until you tell me what this is about." The silence stretched between them, heavy with tension. Finally, the man on the left spoke again. "She's in danger," he repeated. "From someone who knows where she is. We're here to protect her." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had a sinking feeling in his gut, something that told him this wasn't just about a random threat. This was something bigger, something he wasn't prepared for. "I'm not letting you take her," Jake said, his voice low, his muscles tense. "I'll protect her, no matter what it takes." The two men looked at each other, then back at Jake. Finally, the man on the right spoke again. "We understand. But if you want to keep her safe, you need to trust us." Jake didn't trust them. He didn't trust anyone anymore. But one thing was clear. He couldn't let Emma go. Not now. Not after everything. "She stays here," Jake said, his voice firm. The men exchanged another look, then nodded. "As you wish," the man on the left said. "But we'll be keeping an eye on her. And on you." As they turned to leave, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something dangerous. But for now, all he could do was stand his ground, keep Emma safe, and hope that whatever came next, he was ready for it. The days following the visit from the two men in suits were quiet but tense. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening, something that was beyond his control. He had always been the kind of man who relied on his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him to be on alert. Emma, too, seemed to sense the shift. Though she didn't ask questions, her eyes followed him around the garage, the house, and even when they went into town for supplies. She was still the same quiet, curious girl, but there was a new wariness about her, a shadow that wasn't there before. Jake couldn't blame her. The fear he had lived with for so many years had now transferred to her, and he wasn't sure how to shield her from it. One afternoon, as Jake worked on the motorcycle, trying to get it ready for a ride he felt he needed to take, Emma came into the garage with a worried look on her face. She stood by the door, looking up at him with wide eyes, and Jake set his tools down, sensing something was on her mind. "Jake," she said softly. "Who were those men? The ones who came here?" Her voice was small but filled with a quiet strength that caught him off guard. She had been through so much, yet she still managed to find her voice when it mattered. Jake wiped his hands on his jeans, his gaze shifting to the floor for a moment. He wasn't ready to tell her everything, but he knew he couldn't keep it from her forever. "They're not from around here," he said, his voice steady but guarded. "They were looking for you." Emma blinked, her expression confused. "For me? What?" "I don't know yet," Jake replied, his voice lower now, the unease creeping back into his chest. "But they said you're in danger." The words hung between them like a heavy cloud. Emma didn't speak for a moment, just stared at him, trying to process what he had said. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "From who?" Jake didn't know how to answer that. He didn't know who these men were, or why they were looking for Emma, or even why they thought she was in danger. The truth was, Jake was afraid. Afraid that his past, the things he had tried to leave behind, were coming back to haunt him. But he couldn't let her see that fear. "Not now." "I don't know yet, Emma," Jake said, forcing a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "But we'll figure it out." Emma nodded slowly, though Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. She wasn't convinced, but she trusted him. She always had. And that trust was something Jake didn't take lightly. He stood up, walking over to her and putting a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe here," he said firmly. "I won't let anything happen to you." It was the first time he had said those words out loud, and it felt different, real. But the truth was, he wasn't sure if he could keep his promise. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Jake sat alone in the garage, staring at the motorcycle. It had been a long time since he had ridden, and for some reason, he felt like this was the moment he had been waiting for. He needed to get out, to clear his mind, to figure out what was really going on. But as he looked at the bike, the familiar rumble of the engine didn't bring him comfort. It only brought more questions. The two men had left with a warning, but Jake knew they would be back. And next time, they wouldn't be so easy to get rid of. The door to the garage creaked open, and Jake turned to see Emma standing in the doorway, her hair messy from sleep. "Jake," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Can I talk to you?" Jake stood up, walking toward her. "Of course, Emma. What's on your mind?" Emma walked into the garage, looking down at the floor before meeting his gaze. "I don't want to be a burden to you," she said quietly. Jake's heart tightened. He knelt down in front of her, lifting her chin gently so she would look him in the eye. "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "You're the opposite. You've helped me more than you'll ever know." Emma didn't respond right away, but her expression softened. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for something important. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what's happening, but I'm scared. I don't want to lose you." Jake's heart broke at her words. He had spent so much time trying to protect her from the world, but he had never stopped to think about what she was feeling. She was just a child, after all, and this wasn't the life she had imagined. "You won't lose me," he said, his voice steady and full of conviction. "I'm not going anywhere. I promise." Emma gave him a small smile, though her eyes were still filled with fear. "I trust you," she whispered. And in that moment, Jake realized that he couldn't let her down. No matter what came next, he would fight for her. He would protect her, no matter the cost. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to face it alone. And neither was she. The days following their conversation were filled with a strange quiet, a heavy stillness that hung over the garage like a cloud. Jake and Emma spent most of their time working on the bike, trying to keep their minds occupied, but the tension was palpable. Despite his assurances, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He couldn't explain it, but it was there, gnawing at him. Every time he looked at Emma, he saw the trust in her eyes, and it made him more determined to protect her. He didn't know from what, but he would figure it out. That night, as he sat on the couch, his eyes trained on the flickering light of the garage, Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was late, much later than usual, and Jake's instincts kicked in immediately. He stood up, walking toward the door slowly, trying to keep quiet. Emma had long been asleep in her room, and Jake hadn't expected anyone. He peered through the window by the door, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his gun. A dark silhouette stood in the light of the street lamp. At first, he didn't recognize the person, but then it hit him. One of the men from earlier, the ones who had come looking for Emma. He stepped back, his mind racing. He couldn't let them in. Not now. Not when Emma was here. Jake opened the door just a crack, his hand firmly gripping the handle. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though his heart was racing. The man outside looked at him, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "I need to speak with her," the man said, his voice urgent. Jake shook his head, blocking the door with his body. "You're not taking her," Jake said firmly, his voice full of authority. "I don't care who you are, you're not taking her." The man sighed heavily, and for a moment, Jake thought he was going to back down. But instead, the man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You don't understand," he said, his tone shifting. "This isn't a choice. It's not up to you. She's in danger, and you need to trust us. This is bigger than both of you." Jake's grip on the door tightened. "I don't trust you," he said, his voice colder now. "I don't care what you think. She's staying here, safe with me." There was a long silence. Jake could hear the man on the other side of the door exhale slowly, as if weighing his options. "We're not leaving without her," the man finally said, his voice low and dangerous. Jake's pulse quickened. He knew what this meant. They weren't going to just give up. But he wasn't about to let them take Emma. Not without a fight. He stepped back from the door, his eyes scanning the small room for something. anything he could use. His gaze landed on the wrench he had been using earlier to fix the motorcycle. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He turned back toward the door, his mind made up. "I'm not afraid of you," Jake said, his voice quiet but full of determination. He grabbed the wrench, gripping it tightly in his hand. "If you think you're going to take her, you'll have to go through me first." The man outside paused, his eyes narrowing as if trying to size Jake up. But he didn't move. Instead, he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "We're not your enemies," he said. "We're trying to help her." Jake didn't believe him. He had heard that line too many times in his life, and it never turned out to be true. He wasn't about to let this man spin some tale about helping Emma when it was clear they had their own agenda. Help her? Or control her? Jake shot back. "I'm done listening to your lies." Another long silence passed between them. Jake stood firm, his hand tight around the wrench. The man finally stepped back, his voice quieter now. "You don't know what's coming," he said. "But you will. We'll be back." With that, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Jake standing in the doorway, heart pounding in his chest. As soon as the man was gone, Jake closed the door and locked it, his mind racing. He didn't know what was going on, but he knew one thing for sure. Emma was in more danger than he could have ever imagined. He walked back to the small couch where Emma had been sleeping. She was still there, wrapped in a blanket, her breathing steady. For a moment, he just watched her, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could protect her. But he had to try. He had to. The next morning, Jake gathered his things and went to the bike. It wasn't finished yet, but he knew he had to be ready. For whatever was coming. For whatever was waiting for him and Emma. They wouldn't be safe forever. He knew that now. And so, he worked with a sense of urgency. Every motion driven by the thought of protecting the girl who had somehow managed to break through the walls he had built around himself. As he worked, his mind kept returning to the man's words. "You don't know what's coming." Jake didn't know either, but he wasn't about to wait around and find out. He would face whatever came next head on, with everything he had. For Emma, the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the dusty garage, but Jake couldn't bring himself to feel the warmth of it. His hands were stiff from the hours spent working on the motorcycle, and his mind was consumed with thoughts of the man from the night before. He had come back. Or, at least, someone like him would. Jake felt the weight of the wrench in his hand, the steady rhythm of his breathing, but deep down, he knew this calm wouldn't last. He couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. Emma had gone to bed hours ago, the quiet of the house making her absence almost unbearable. He hadn't heard her laugh in what seemed like forever. The house was too still, and Jake knew he was the cause of that. He was the one keeping her in this uncertain place, dragging her into something he couldn't control. But she was safer here, at least for now. The memory of the man's voice echoed in his mind. "You don't know what's coming." And Jake didn't know what to make of that warning. He didn't know who these people were or why they were interested in Emma. But he wasn't going to let them take her. Not without a fight. He had spent too long running from his past, hiding from the things he had done, the people he had hurt. But that was all behind him now. His only concern was Emma. He couldn't lose her. As Jake paced around the garage, the shadows growing longer in the fading light, he heard the faintest sound, a crack in the silence. He froze, his instincts immediately kicking in. It was a car. Slowly, carefully, he made his way to the window, peering out into the street. His heart skipped a beat when he saw a dark vehicle pull up. Another SUV. His hand instinctively reached for the handle of the gun he kept hidden behind the toolbox. The two men from before hadn't given up. They had come back. Jake's mind raced as he thought about what to do. He couldn't let them take Emma. He couldn't let them drag her into whatever mess they were tangled in. He quickly grabbed a jacket, slipping out the back door into the yard, moving as quietly as he could. He needed to get to her before they did. The night air was crisp, the cold biting into his skin, but Jake didn't feel it. All he could think about was Emma, safe and sound in her room, blissfully unaware of the danger that was closing in on them. He reached the back door of the house, his heart pounding as he carefully eased it open. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Emma was asleep, just as he had left her. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her, trying to calm the storm inside his chest. But then the sound of footsteps on the gravel outside made him snap into action. He couldn't risk being caught off guard. He moved quickly, kneeling beside her bed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emma, wake up." She stirred, but didn't fully wake. Jake shook her gently, his voice urgent. "Emma, we need to go? Now." Her eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding her face for a moment before recognition settled in. "Jake? What's going on?" He didn't have time for explanations. "Get dressed. Hurry." Emma didn't ask questions. She just nodded and got up, pulling on her shoes and jacket. Jake moved to the window, peeking through the blinds, his heart hammering in his chest. He saw them, the two men, standing near the SUV, their figures outlined against the headlights. This wasn't just a visit anymore. They weren't here to talk. They were here to take her. He felt his blood run cold. He couldn't let them get to her. Not without a fight. He turned back to Emma, who was standing beside him, her eyes wide with fear, but also a quiet determination. "I don't want to go," she said softly, but firmly. "I'm not going to leave you." Jake's heart ached at her words. She was too young to be in this kind of danger. Too young to be dragged into the mess of his past. But he wasn't going to let them take her. Not without a fight. "We don't have a choice, Emma," he said, his voice low and steady. "We need to leave. Now." As they made their way out of the house and into the yard, Jake's mind raced with possible escape routes. The garage, the bike. He could take her out on the road. But where would they go? The night was dark, the road ahead uncertain. The only thing he knew for sure was that they had to get out of here. They had to keep moving. He pulled the motorcycle out of the garage, the engine roaring to life as he revved it, the familiar sound grounding him. Emma climbed on behind him, holding on tightly. "Hold on," Jake said, his voice steady, but his heart was racing. He was used to danger, but this felt different. This felt personal. They sped down the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness, the cold wind whipping past them. Jake didn't look back. He couldn't. They were leaving everything behind, and he didn't know if they'd ever come back. But he couldn't risk staying. Not now. Not with her life on the line. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was doing something right. He was protecting her, and that was all that mattered. The engine roared as Jake accelerated down the dark highway, the headlights slicing through the pitch-black night. The wind cut across his face, sharp and cold, but it didn't matter. He couldn't feel it. His thoughts were on Emma, who was holding on tightly behind him, her small arms wrapped around his waist. He could feel her warmth through the layers of leather and fabric, and he took comfort in the fact that she was with him. She was safe. For now. But as the road stretched out before them, Jake knew the peace wouldn't last long. The men from earlier had made it clear that they were coming for her. Jake didn't know who they were, but they had to be connected to something much bigger than he could understand. All he knew was that Emma was in danger, and he wasn't about to let anyone take her from him. He pushed the bike faster, the rumble of the engine drowning out everything else, as if the speed could outrun the fear that was creeping up on him. Emma's grip tightened slightly, and Jake glanced over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of her pale face in the headlights. Her eyes were wide with worry, but there was something else there too, trust. She trusted him. That trust weighed heavily on his heart. He couldn't fail her. Not again. Not after everything they had been through together. After what felt like an eternity, Jake spotted the turn-off he was looking for. It was a small, isolated motel, the kind that only locals knew about. He had used it once before, a long time ago, when he had nowhere else to go. He slowed the bike and pulled into the lot, the tires skidding slightly on the gravel. He parked in the shadows, away from the main building, and cut the engine. Silence fell over them. Emma didn't say anything, but Jake could tell she was nervous. He was too. He didn't know what was waiting for them here, but it was their only option for now. "Stay close," Jake said softly as he dismounted the bike and helped Emma off. She nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. He could tell she was scared, but she didn't show it. She was stronger than she realized. Jake led her to the motel door, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. He knocked once, twice. After a few seconds, the door creaked open, revealing a man with a weathered face and tired eyes. "Jake Morrison," he said, his voice gravelly but not unfriendly. "It's been a long time." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the room beyond the door. "I need a place to stay. Just for tonight." The man studied him for a moment before stepping aside. "You know the rules," he said, his tone softer now. "Pay up front, no questions asked. And you'll be gone by morning." Jake nodded again and reached into his pocket, pulling out a wad of cash. He handed it over without hesitation. The man took it, glancing at Emma with a raised eyebrow, but saying nothing. "I understand," Jake said, stepping inside with Emma. He closed the door behind them, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. They were safe. For now. The room was small, the air thick with the smell of old wood and musty carpet. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Jake walked to the window, peering out into the night. He couldn't see anything, but he knew the men were out there somewhere, looking for them. "Jake, are we going to be okay?" Emma's voice broke through the silence, and he turned to find her standing near the bed, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked small, fragile, like a child who had seen too much for her age. "We will be," Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'll make sure of it." He walked over to her, kneeling down so that they were eye level. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," he said, his words fierce and determined. Emma looked at him, her wide eyes filled with so many questions, so much fear. But she didn't ask. She didn't need to. She trusted him. And that was enough for now. Jake stood up and walked over to the small table near the door, sitting down heavily in the chair. He ran a hand over his face, trying to think, to plan. But all he could see was Emma, her face etched with worry. He had to protect her. He had to keep her safe. The storm had come for them, and now they were on the run. He didn't know where they were going next, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until she was out of danger. He glanced at Emma again, who was sitting on the bed now, her small frame curled up under the thin blanket. She was exhausted, and so was he. But there was no time to rest. Not now. Not until they figured out who was after her and why. The night stretched on, the minutes ticking by as Jake sat in silence, waiting for something to change. But nothing did. The room was still, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the danger was closer than he wanted to admit. Emma had fallen asleep, her breathing soft and even, and Jake took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. He had promised her he would protect her, and that was a promise he would keep, no matter what came next. The world outside seemed so far away, but Jake knew that the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. The following morning, Jake woke with a start. The light filtering through the cracks in the curtains was too bright for how little sleep he had gotten. His mind was still racing from the events of the night before, the tension building in his chest like a ticking bomb. The room was quiet, too quiet. He glanced at Emma, still curled up in the bed, her small frame tucked into the blankets, looking so peaceful. For a moment, he just watched her sleep, the rise and fall of her chest steady and calm. It was a reminder of how fragile their situation really was. He had promised to protect her, but every moment they stayed here brought them closer to being discovered. He couldn't keep running. Not like this. But he had to think. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts, sending a jolt of adrenaline through his body. He froze. The knock came again, this time harder, more insistent. Someone was outside. Jake's heart raced, and he quickly moved to the window, peering through the curtains. The street outside was quiet, and the SUV was still parked nearby. Whoever was knocking wasn't giving up. He turned back to Emma, whose eyes fluttered open at the sound of the knock. She looked confused at first, but then recognition flashed across her face. "Jake, who is it?" she asked softly, sitting up in bed. Jake held up a finger to his lips, signaling for her to stay quiet. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly moved to the door, his footsteps as silent as possible. He wasn't sure who was on the other side, but he couldn't risk it. Not now. Not when they were this close to safety. He looked through the peephole, but saw nothing. Only a dark blur on the other side of the door. His instincts screamed at him to open it, to face whatever was waiting for him, but he couldn't risk it. Not with Emma there. His hand went to his jacket, his fingers brushing against the gun tucked under his leather, but he hesitated. It wasn't about fighting anymore. It was about surviving. He took a deep breath and turned to Emma, who was standing now, her eyes wide with concern. "Stay here. Don't move," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He took another step toward the door, ready to confront whatever was on the other side. The knock came again, more forcefully this time, followed by a voice, low and gruff. "Jake, open up. We need to talk." It was the voice from the night before, the man who had warned him about what was coming. Jake's stomach twisted. He knew it wasn't just a casual visit. The danger was here. He had to face it. He slowly opened the door a crack, just enough to see the man standing on the other side. "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the fear churning inside him. The man looked at him, his face shadowed, but Jake could see the seriousness in his eyes. "We need to talk, Jake," the man said again, his tone urgent. "It's not safe here. They're coming." Jake's mind raced. Who's coming? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure they weren't being watched. "The people after the girl," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake felt his heart stop. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. "I don't know who you are, but I'm not letting anyone take her," Jake said, his voice low but firm. The man sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I get it, Jake. I really do. But you're not going to be able to stop them. They'll come for her, and when they do, it'll be a lot worse than you think. I'm trying to help you." Jake stared at him, disbelief flashing across his face. "Help me? How?" "You don't have much time," the man said urgently, his voice tight with something Jake couldn't quite place. "You need to get out of here. You need to leave, now, before they find you." Jake shook his head, his fists clenching. "I'm not running," he said. "I'm staying and protecting her. That's it." The man looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice cold now. "They're coming. And when they do, they'll leave nothing behind." Jake stood there, his hand still on the door, his mind reeling. This wasn't just about protecting Emma anymore. This was about survival. He had to do something. But what? The man didn't wait for Jake to respond. Instead, he stepped back, his eyes scanning the area around them. "You don't have much time. The next few hours are critical. Make a choice, Jake." With that, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the night. Jake stood there for a long moment, his mind spinning. He looked back at Emma, still standing in the room, watching him closely. She could feel it too. The danger. The fear. But Jake didn't know what to do. He didn't know where to go, or how to keep her safe. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let anyone take her. Not without a fight. The door clicked shut behind him as Jake stood motionless in the dim light of the motel room, the words from the man echoing in his mind. He had told Jake to leave, to run, but there was no running now. There was nowhere to go, no way to escape from what was coming. He had been down that road before, running from his past, hiding from the mistakes he had made. But he couldn't hide anymore, not with Emma in the picture. He had made a promise to her, and he wasn't about to break it. Jake turned to Emma, who was standing silently in the corner of the room, her eyes wide, her small frame trembling. She had heard everything. "Jake, what's going to happen?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. It hit him like a punch in the gut, the vulnerability in her voice, the fear in her eyes. He had spent so long hiding his own fears, burying them deep down, but now, as he looked at her, he knew he couldn't protect her by pretending everything was okay. He walked over to her, kneeling down so that they were eye level. "I don't know yet," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I'll keep you safe, no matter what." Emma nodded slowly, her lips trembling, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. She trusted him, and that trust was more than he could ever repay. The weight of his promise felt heavier than ever now. The knock on the door had only made things clearer. They weren't safe here, and running wouldn't make them safe either. The people who were after Emma weren't going to stop until they had her. And Jake wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. Jake stood up and walked to the small window, peering out into the night. The street was empty, the only sound the occasional passing car, but his gut told him that wasn't going to last. He had to move. He had to figure out what was really going on before it was too late. He turned back to Emma, who had followed him to the window, her eyes searching his face. "We're leaving," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. "We're not staying here. Not tonight." Emma's eyes widened. "But where will we go?" Jake hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. He didn't have a plan. He didn't know where they could go or how they would make it out of this mess. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her down. "I'll figure it out," he said, his voice thick with resolve. "Just trust me." Emma nodded, though Jake could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. She was scared. He could see it in the way she held herself, the way she clenched her fists at her sides. But she wasn't crying. She wasn't asking questions. She was ready to fight, just like him. That gave him the strength he needed. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, his mind still racing. They couldn't stay here. The men who had been looking for them were out there, and if they knew Jake was still in the area, it was only a matter of time before they came looking for him. He turned back to Emma, who was standing by the door, her eyes full of determination. She was ready. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice firm. Together, they stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at their skin. Jake didn't know where they were going, but he knew they couldn't stay here. They couldn't stay anywhere for long. Not with the kind of people who were hunting them. As they walked, the sound of their footsteps was drowned out by the low hum of traffic in the distance, the world around them quiet and empty. Jake felt a strange sense of peace wash over him, despite the chaos that was closing in on them. He had Emma, and that was all that mattered. They weren't alone anymore. They were in this together. And no matter what came next, he would protect her. He would keep her safe. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and with each step, Jake's thoughts grew darker. He couldn't help but wonder if he was making the right choice, if running was the only way to protect her. But there was no turning back now. They were already too deep in it. They had to keep moving. They couldn't stop. And just as the first rays of dawn began to break through the horizon, Jake spotted a gas station up ahead. It wasn't much, but it was something. A place to stop. A place to catch their breath. He headed for it, hoping that it would be enough to give them some time to figure out what to do next. When they reached the gas station, Jake parked the bike near the back, out of sight. He turned to Emma, who had been quiet the entire ride. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, the tension beginning to ease just a little. Emma nodded, though she still looked uncertain. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice small. "I know," Jake said, his heart breaking at the vulnerability in her voice. "But we'll be all right. As long as we stick together, we'll be all right." He didn't know how he could promise that, but he had to. He had to keep her calm, keep her safe. They had a long road ahead of them, and he didn't know what was waiting for them at the end. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. He wasn't going to lose her. Not now. Not ever. The sun had barely risen when Jake started the bike, the low rumble of the engine reverberating in the still morning air. He could feel Emma behind him, her small arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her breath shallow against his back. They hadn't spoken much after they left the gas station, and Jake could sense the unease growing between them. The silence felt heavy, oppressive even, as if the weight of everything they had been through was too much to bear. The road stretched out in front of them, endless and empty, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder once, then twice, but all he saw was the stretch of desolate highway. The fear gnawing at him didn't subside. The man's words echoed in his mind. "They're coming. You don't know what's coming." Jake didn't know what was coming, but he knew he couldn't wait around to find out. Emma's grip tightened slightly, pulling him from his thoughts. He could feel her tension, her fear, even though she wasn't saying anything. She had been through so much already. And yet here they were, still running, still hiding. Jake wished he had answers for her, but the truth was, he didn't have any answers. The only thing he knew was that they had to keep moving. The world outside seemed to be closing in on them, and Jake wasn't sure how much longer they could outrun whatever it was chasing them. They had no destination, no clear plan, just the road ahead and the uncertainty that came with it. As they rode, Jake's thoughts drifted back to the last time he had been in a situation like this. A lifetime ago, when he had ridden with the Hells Angels, he had been fearless, confident that nothing could touch him. But that was before the violence, before the betrayals, before the endless cycle of hurt that had followed him everywhere he went. He had walked away from it all, hoping to leave the past behind. But now, with Emma in his life, his past seemed to have caught up with him. The people who were after her weren't just any strangers. They were connected to something much bigger than either of them. Jake had been running from his past for so long that he had never stopped to think about what would happen when it finally caught up with him. He had no choice but to face it now. They pulled off the highway and into a small, quiet town. The place seemed almost abandoned, the buildings old and weathered, with boarded-up windows and empty streets. It felt like they had entered another world, one that was far removed from the chaos that had consumed their lives. Jake parked the bike in the lot of a rundown motel and killed the engine. He turned to Emma, who had already dismounted, her eyes scanning their surroundings. "Stay close," Jake said, his voice low. "We don't know how much time we have." Emma nodded, her expression serious, though Jake could see the hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't sure what to make of this place either. It was clear that something was wrong, but they had nowhere else to go. The motel owner, an older man with a gruff voice and a weathered face, handed Jake the keys to a room at the back of the building. "It's quiet here," he said, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to come through the door. "Don't stay too long. Not many folks come around these parts anymore." Jake nodded, giving the man a small smile of thanks before leading Emma to the room. The air inside was thick with dust, the bed unmade, and the faint smell of mildew lingering in the corners. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. And right now, that was all that mattered. They settled in, locking the door behind them. Jake paced the small room, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. There was no escaping the truth. Someone was after Emma. He had to protect her. He couldn't let anything happen to her. He could hear Emma moving around the room behind him, but he didn't turn to face her. He didn't know what to say. He couldn't make her any promises that he wasn't sure he could keep. "Jake," Emma said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. He turned to look at her, and for the first time in a long while, he saw the fear in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of the unknown, but the fear of the reality they were facing. She wasn't just afraid for herself anymore. She was afraid for him too. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice so small that Jake had to strain to hear it. The question hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just a child's fear. It was the question he had been asking himself since the moment he had promised to protect her. He wanted to tell her that everything would be fine, that they would be safe. But he couldn't lie to her. "I don't know, Emma," he said, his voice rough. "But I'll do everything I can to keep you safe." She didn't say anything more, but her silence spoke volumes. She was scared, and so was he. But they had no choice but to keep moving forward, no matter how uncertain the road ahead seemed. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of it all. He couldn't let fear control him. He had to find a way out of this mess. They couldn't stay in the motel forever. But where could they go? He glanced over at Emma, who was sitting on the other side of the room, her eyes lost in thought. It was clear that she was doing the same thing. Thinking, wondering, worrying about what was coming next. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, more to himself than to her. "We'll keep moving. We'll stay ahead of them." He didn't know if that was true, but it was all he could offer her. And right now, it had to be enough. The morning after their brief stay at the motel, Jake awoke to the sound of the wind picking up outside. He sat up slowly, his body aching from the ride and lack of sleep, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had spent hours thinking through every possibility, trying to come up with a plan, but the truth was that he had no clear idea of what to do next. The danger was closing in on them, and he had no idea who the people after Emma were or what they wanted with her. What he did know was that he had made a promise to keep her safe. He couldn't break that promise. Jake turned to look at Emma, still fast asleep on the bed, her small form curled up under the blanket. She had been through so much, and yet she still found comfort in sleep. Her innocence was a stark contrast to the harsh world they were living in now. Jake felt a pang of guilt as he watched her, knowing that she deserved so much better than this. She didn't deserve to be caught up in his past, in the mess that he had left behind when he walked away from the Hells Angels. But he also knew there was no turning back. He couldn't leave her. He had to find a way to protect her. He stood up quietly, careful not to wake her, and walked over to the window. The street outside was empty, the town still quiet as the sun slowly rose over the horizon. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew he had to act fast. They couldn't stay in this motel forever. They had to keep moving, but where could they go? Jake didn't have many options, but he had one place in mind. A friend who owed him a favor. A man who had connections, someone who might be able to help them lay low for a while. It was risky, but it was their best shot. He grabbed his jacket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the gun he kept hidden inside, and moved toward the door. As he stepped outside, he felt the chill of the morning air against his skin, but it wasn't the cold that made his stomach twist. It was the sense that they were being watched. Jake looked around, scanning the area, but saw nothing. He had been a biker long enough to know when something was off, and right now, everything felt wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being tracked, that someone was closing in on them. He walked quickly to the bike, his hand resting on the handlebars as he waited for Emma to join him. It didn't take long before she appeared at the door, her face pale and her eyes filled with the same concern that had been haunting him for days. "Jake, where are we going?" she asked softly, her voice laced with fear. Jake looked at her, his expression hardening as he tried to reassure her. "I'm taking you somewhere safe. I promise." He didn't know if it was true, but he had to say it. He had to make her believe it. Emma nodded, though Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She was scared, but she wasn't asking questions. She was trusting him, and that was all he could ask for. As they sped down the empty road, Jake kept his eyes peeled, always looking for signs that they were being followed. He didn't trust anyone anymore, not after everything that had happened. Not after the men had come to the motel the night before, warning him that they were too close, that it was too late to run. The road stretched out in front of them, endless and unforgiving, but Jake didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. Emma needed him. He wasn't going to let her down. They passed through small towns, the buildings disappearing behind them as they rode farther into the countryside. The further they got from the motel, the more Jake felt like they were slipping away from the danger that was lurking, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. They reached the turnoff to his friend's place by late afternoon, and Jake made a sharp left, driving down a dirt road that led to an old farmhouse. The place had been abandoned for years, but his friend still kept it as a hideout. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. Jake parked the bike in front of the house and helped Emma off, keeping a close eye on their surroundings. "Stay close," he said as he led her up to the door. He knocked once, then twice, and waited. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a man who looked like he hadn't seen the light of day in years. He was tall, with a gruff face and wild hair, his eyes tired but sharp. "Jake," he said with a nod, his voice deep and rough. "What are you doing here?" "I need your help," Jake replied, his voice firm. "It's urgent." The man studied him for a moment before stepping aside, allowing them to enter. "Come in," he said, closing the door behind them. The house was dark and smelled of dust, the air thick with neglect. But Jake didn't care. He didn't need comfort. He just needed a place to keep Emma safe, even if it was for just a little while. As they settled in, the man sat down at the table, eyeing Jake carefully. "What's going on?" he asked. Jake hesitated, but only for a moment. "They're after her," he said quietly, nodding toward Emma, who was sitting by the window, looking out at the road. "I don't know who they are, but I need to keep her safe. I don't know how long we can stay here." The man leaned back in his chair, his face serious. "You're not going anywhere. Not yet. We'll figure this out." But Jake knew the truth. They couldn't stay here forever. And the clock was ticking. They were running out of time. The days that followed were filled with unease. Despite the safe house and the temporary calm that had settled over them, Jake could feel the storm still brewing. Every time he stepped outside, he couldn't shake the sensation that they were being watched. The feeling of being hunted was never far from his mind. He had Emma to protect, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. They spent their time in the house, trying to keep things normal, but normal was a distant memory. Emma had gotten used to the quiet, the days spent in the house, her small hands busy with books and toys as she tried to keep her mind occupied. But Jake knew she was scared. He saw it in her eyes every time he looked at her, in the way she jumped at the smallest sound, the way she would cling to him when he entered a room. She was still a child, and no matter how hard he tried to shield her from the truth, she could feel the weight of what was happening. Jake had promised her that he would protect her, that she would be safe. But as the days passed, he could feel the pressure building. It wasn't going to be long before the people looking for her found them. He couldn't keep running, and he couldn't let her face whatever was coming alone. One morning, Jake woke up with the feeling that today was different. The air in the house felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. He couldn't shake the sensation that something was about to change. He had been waiting for a sign, some kind of direction, but it hadn't come. Not until that morning. He stood by the window, watching the world outside, when he saw a black car pull up to the end of the dirt road. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he watched the vehicle stop and two men step out. They were wearing suits, their expressions cold and determined. Jake didn't know if they were the same men who had been looking for Emma, but he didn't care. He wasn't going to let them get any closer. He turned to Emma, who was sitting on the couch, her eyes focused on the book in her hands. "Emma," he said, his voice steady but urgent, "we need to leave. Now." Emma looked up at him, confusion in her eyes. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice small. Jake didn't have time to explain. "They found us," he said simply, grabbing his jacket. "Get your things. We're leaving." Emma didn't question him. She stood up, moving quickly to gather her few belongings. She trusted him, and that was enough. Jake grabbed the keys to the motorcycle, his mind racing as he tried to think of a plan. He didn't know where they would go, but he couldn't stay here. Not with those men so close. They were running out of time. As they stepped outside, Jake's eyes scanned the area. The black car was parked just a few hundred feet away, the two men standing by it, looking in their direction. There was no time to waste. Jake helped Emma onto the bike, his heart pounding in his chest as he revved the engine. The road ahead was their only option. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew they couldn't stay here. Not anymore. They sped down the road, the wind whipping past them as the world around them blurred. The motorcycle's engine roared, but Jake's mind was focused entirely on Emma. She was holding on tightly, her small body pressed against his back, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. They were in this together, and Jake wasn't going to let anything happen to her. As they rode, the sense of being chased never left. He kept glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see the black car behind them, but the road was empty. Still, the unease gnawed at him. The world was closing in on them, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before the people who were after Emma caught up with them. But for now, they were free. For now, they had time. The road stretched ahead, winding through forests and fields, the landscape unfamiliar but welcoming. Jake didn't know where it would take them, but he couldn't stop now. He had to keep moving. He had to keep Emma safe. As the hours passed, the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the horizon. Jake knew they had to find shelter for the night. He couldn't risk riding through the night, not when Emma needed rest. He pulled into a small town, the first one they had seen in hours. He parked the bike in the shadows of an old gas station and looked around. The town seemed quiet, almost abandoned, but Jake wasn't taking any chances. He kept his hand on the gun tucked into his waistband, just in case. "Stay close," he said to Emma as they dismounted. She nodded, her hand slipping into his. They walked quickly toward the nearest motel, Jake's eyes scanning the area as they passed darkened storefronts. The clerk at the desk barely looked up as they checked in. Jake paid for a room, keeping his movements as casual as possible. He didn't want to draw attention. Not now. Not with the men still looking for them. They made their way to the room, and Jake locked the door behind them. It wasn't much, just a small, dimly lit room with a single bed and a cracked window. But it was safe for the moment. Jake took a deep breath and sat down on the edge of the bed. Emma sat next to him, her eyes still wide, still uncertain. "We'll keep moving tomorrow," Jake said, his voice tired but resolute. "We can't stop. But tonight, we rest." Emma nodded again, her head resting on his shoulder. Jake looked out the window, the night now fully settled around them. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know how much longer they could keep running. But for tonight, they were safe. For tonight, that was enough.